You got to stay current. If you're successful, someone's coming after you. The folks at Redpoint asked me, whose ox gets gored? And I do believe that. I believe for every winner there is a loser. I don't believe that there's free money sitting around waiting for something. I think AI is going to crush a number of organizations in this valley. You will, by definition, speak to too many people who will tell you they just want tomorrow to feel like today. People don't like change. They resist it. You can fail your way to the top in Silicon Valley. If you really want to be the best in tech, you kind of have to come here. Opinion exists on the inside, and fact can only exist on the outside. The hard part for some people, and I'm guilty of it, is you fall in love with what you're doing.
Anthony, before we get into tech cycles and the Valley's evolution, I want to start simple. Who was Anthony before Silicon Valley? And what were you searching for when you came out here?
Great question. Thanks very much for having me on for us. Like you, I grew up in the UK. I was born in a very small village, Corfe Castle, if there are people that want to Google it, and grew up, I think, in an environment that frustrated me ultimately, that I think limited the sort of the opportunity. I grew up in a UK environment that was sort of generational employment. My father was a policeman and then became a probation officer. Friends of mine followed in their father's footsteps. I was fortunate enough to go to a very good university where most of my class, we studied engineering, never did engineering. They sort of went and became lawyers and accountants and consultants, or they went to work for the armed forces. So it was a very sort of established career path. And I just sort of fell in love with computing. And what I enjoyed about it the most was there wasn't a legacy, there wasn't a history. And younger people could do things that older people couldn't. I think the other thing that frustrated me was there was this sort of real problem with failure in the UK, that it was very much a bad thing, that bankruptcy or failed companies. I knew lots of people that tried, and if they failed, they were sort of shunned. The banks wouldn't give them a second chance. And I think that sort of legacy frustrated me to the point where I sort of wanted to be a part of something different, and really sort of fell in love with Silicon Valley and the tech business, mostly because as a younger person, I didn't see limits. I just saw opportunity, and in the Valley, I just saw this wonderful culture of risk-taking and celebrating failure. So I've been here now 30 years in the Valley, and I've loved every minute of it for us. The weather helps, as you can testify, but it's an environment that just keeps generating opportunity, that keeps reimagining itself. And people have predicted the end of Silicon Valley and Silicon Alley in New York and all these other places. And you know what? It's still here. Yeah. Every time they sort of say, well, it can't continue, it does. And look at AI for us. It's all here. It's really all here. Microsoft and Amazon, yes, they're in Seattle, but their AI and their core engineering is still done here. So it was really a frustration and a sort of a technology catalyst that sort of led me to to try and make a living somewhere completely different from where I grew up.
I love that. And I think there's so much for us to unpack as far as not just, as you said, both of us have come from the UK, and there's so much that we have that's driven us to being in the Valley. But I think also it takes a certain individual to want to go out there and build something, whether you're in the Valley or whether you're in London and you decide to make that shift. And I think for me personally, it's always been this driving force, something that a purpose to go out there and build something unique, whatever that is. And if you fail, it's okay. You can keep going. What was it for you? At what point did you think you're out in the UK and you're thinking, I'm excited about technology, but I could have just been out in the UK to do something in tech. But what was it about going out to the US, being in Silicon Valley, that thought this is the place to be to build something?
Honestly, I think I found commonality amongst the people out here. No disrespect to my homeland, you'll probably agree that when you went out and you were socializing with people, firstly, you didn't find anybody else that was in tech back then. So it was a fairly kind of lackluster conversation about innovation and disruption because you were talking to accountants and lawyers and doctors, and that was pretty dull. The other thing I would tell you is I think that there was just a desire here that didn't exist in the UK. I would suggest it's gotten better in the UK, but I don't think anywhere really has the same dynamic as the sort of the peninsula between San Francisco and San Jose. It's a very special place, and I think people that are fortunate enough to come here really see, I think, the opportunity. For me, it was just in the United States, people really wanted to help people succeed. And I hate to say this, but the UK had a terrible class system, and it didn't really help you succeed. When you would go out, whereas in London, the questions I would get was sort of, where did you go to school and what does your father do? And I was, what does that matter? Whereas here, they sort of celebrate immigrants. They sort of celebrate diversity. And it's funny, I'll just give you a quick anecdote. Terms that people use in the UK are very much glass half empty. Terms we use over here are very much glass half full. And it's just a conditioning for us. So when you go out for dinner and the chef comes out and says, how was dinner? The English response is, it's not bad. I mean, just think about that. It's not bad. What you really mean is, it's good. But the Brits, we just can't quite get there. And when I first came to the States and you go into a fast food chain and they serve you and they say, have a nice day, have a great day, you feel, don't patronize me. And then you're, oh, they actually mean it. They actually are, they're actually being nice. Whereas in the UK, it was never really, you never really could have that sort of vulnerability and that sort of emotional attachment. British people may think the Americans are sort of conceited, but we're not. I mean, I think Americans really have demonstrated through various generations their honesty and their integrity. Now, I'm not going to go political or anything like that, but here in the Valley, you are celebrated for trying. Whether you succeed or fail, you are celebrated. And I love that because I have failed. And I will tell you, you learn a lot more on the way down than you do on the way up. Yeah. But the Valley picks you up and celebrates your attempt. And I think that's a magical thing about here.
I cannot agree more. I think for me, I moved out in 2015. And so I started in tech recruiting in 2009. And I was sold on the idea that it's a meritocratic environment and you don't need to be in this job for 10, 20, 30 years to go up the ladder. You can create your own opportunities. It didn't exist. I remember a number of times where you're having a conversation with an IT director or an IT manager over £1,000 or £2,000 of increase in the salary for a candidate versus come out to the US and it's a very different conversation. And there's this, it's not just about money, but it's just this idea of wanting to do business and wanting to succeed. And going back to 2015, for me, it was a very small moment where I thought, this is it. I probably don't want to do this anymore. But it was an opportunity to go out to San Francisco. And as soon as I got there, honestly, it was instant. Within a few days of just going out and meeting a few people before, and I realized this is very different. Relationships they mean something. Now, of course, they do mean something, but if you don't deliver, that's a different conversation. But they do mean something. I think that's what's resonated with me. But there's something else as well. Like, we're both from the UK and we obviously love our homeland. But there is also this, I guess an area that I wanted to really touch on is innovation and controlling innovation or stifling innovation, not letting innovation truly flourish. And I feel like outside of Silicon Valley, outside of where we are, if you look at the UK and Europe, especially Europe, with laws like GDPR, etc., I get the consensus behind it, but I think there's so many regulations that stop the opportunity for growth. How do you feel about that?
I agree with you. I think technology, and certainly the intentions of 99.9% of the technology companies is to really do good and to improve the overall experience and opportunity for individuals as consumers or employees and companies to create competitive advantage. And I think in prior examples, we spoke earlier about the Internet Explorer example, it was sort of probably necessary, but happened 10 years too late. I do feel that governments have a real challenge keeping up with the rate of change that we experience here. I don't know what you would say, Faraz, but it's tough out here. You've got to work hard, and you've got to always watch your back, because someone's coming after you. If you're successful, someone's coming after you. You got to stay current. And if you think about the names of the companies that have come and gone in this valley, it's quite striking to think about it. When I first came here, my boss at the time told me to be careful, that the valley was run by Sun, HP, IBM, DEC. And then 5 years later, well, it's not them anymore. It's Oracle and Sybase and Ingress and Informix. And then 5 years later, it's not them anymore. It's Yahoo, Excited Home. And then it's not them anymore. It's Google and Facebook. And now it's like, well, it's not them anymore either. It's OpenAI and Anthropic and Cohere. And just think about that. I've been here for 30 years, and the companies have come and gone. And the companies that failed, I think, are the companies that didn't constantly worry about disruption and transformation. They thought they'd nailed it, and they became sort of complacent because they were successful, and that success, I think, created blind spots where smaller companies could reimagine a problem and be successful. At the same point, while they were growing, the oligopolies were denying the changes. AI. I think AI is going to crush a number of organizations in this valley. Some very large, very successful SaaS companies are thinking of AI as evolutionary because of their install base. And I think that's going to be probably the reason they fail. It's an environment, I think, that governments have to understand and appreciate and recognize. When I first came here, Faraz, tech was an industry. And now tech is every industry. It really is. And I'm blessed for that. And I do think government needs to understand it. And I think it needs to keep up with it and regulate, obviously, in certain areas, but not I think, as it has done, which is too little, too late, or without enough information to make a good enough decision. It's catching up, but it's still behind. I mean, it's regulating Google now at a time where Google is losing share. I don't think it has the first idea of what OpenAI, what Anthropic, and all these other companies are doing. So Europe has, I think, struggled, like I think many sort of legacy countries, to appreciate and to understand the way in which certainly this valley works and operates.
Regulation is important, and if you don't have regulation, there could be some serious problems that can occur. So I don't think that having regulation is the issue. I think it's over-regulation, and it's more targeted. I think some of these laws are targeted at the big companies to design to control, because they know the revenue is huge and how we can get a piece of that.
Exactly.
And it's sad to see, because I feel like, let's use the UK as an example, right? There is a company that I'm sure you're aware of called Revolut in the UK that is probably one of the most successful companies right now in the UK. But because of the way that the government is thinking about tax laws, it is pushing successful organizations, especially successful CEOs, out of the country. They're leaving. That's sad to see, because you think about how much job creation is made or created from those companies, and the value those companies bring to the economy overall. It's also sad to see that there is probably a handful of companies you can only really talk about as far as Europe that really stick out. Whereas if you look at Silicon Valley, just in the peninsula, how many companies can you and I name today that are doing exceptionally well? Even recently with Jeff Bezos coming up with a new company that he's now building, it's the excitement of building, which is really what it's all about. Do you think that when you go back 30 years ago and you made the decision to make the move, besides the excitement and compute technology and computers and being part of this ecosystem, were you coming out here because of the passion for the technology and to build something? Or were you coming out here not just for that, but really make something of yourself and be ultra successful that you felt perhaps where we came from, maybe there's a lack of access to that world?
Yeah, look, I mean, I didn't grow up rich. I didn't have the hereditary things that sort of a lot of the arguably successful people in the UK have. And I felt that it was sort of an environment that wasn't a place where I had the most fun and the most opportunity, and I had to sort of almost pretend to be like them. And I wasn't like them. I was a roll your sleeves up, kind of get to work kind of person. And I just didn't like my chances in the UK. And I just thought to myself that there was an environment and a thing, a technology thing, that was going to rewrite, history. I liked it. When I was at university, I just remember doing things on Sun computers that my professors didn't understand. And I grasped that sort of idea of, wow, this is power. And with that power comes opportunity. And I just felt that if I could be at the forefront of this transformation and all of the others, that you could sort of do things in an environment like this that you just couldn't do there. I guess, the only analogy I might give you is if you really want to be the best in finance, you kind of have to go to Wall Street. And if you really want to be the best in tech, I mean, the best, and you want to really try your hand at disruption and transformation and technology innovation, you kind of have to come here. There really isn't another place quite like this, but it's hard. I mean, the things that I have had to relearn and the things I've had to accept as change, as the fundamentals of change, have really been difficult. Look, I'm old now, and I just had to go through and relearn all of the various things around artificial intelligence and machine learning and natural language models and large language models. And I had to go and do that. I had to take classes. I had to roll my sleeves up and code and learn how these things work so that I could apply them into the business, but to apply them from sort of reimagining or sort of revolution. I think a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that the world evolves. And I don't think it does. I think there are disruptions that sort of hit the equilibrium and disrupt it at a point where I think the existing oligopolies sort of don't like it, so they deny it. And that gives the sort of the entrepreneur the opportunity to start. But honestly, Faraz, I fell in love with Sun workstations and with network computing. And Sun was here. They were just here in Mountain View, and you could go to the lobby and meet Scott McNeely and all of the wonderful engineers that sort of built that great company. And you'd look at when the companies were founded and compare them to where the companies in the UK were founded. You'd be, oh my God, this company's 10 years old. Rolls-Royce is like 100 years old. And, it was just a wonderful time. And it still is. It still is an amazing time.
It takes me on to my second topic that I wanted to touch on, which is the cycles of innovation over the last 30 years. You've seen it all. And it seems like there's always a new incumbent, or at least a few new incumbents every 5 to 10 years. As you said earlier on, conversation you had when you first joined, be careful, these are the big winners. And then a few years later, the next big winners. Why is that? I mean, it's not just technology, right? I mean, maybe it is to a certain degree, but it is everywhere. Why is it so important that books like The Innovator's Dilemma and Only the Paranoia Survive by Andy Grove, the sort of the importance of having that finger on the pulse, and there really isn't such thing as product market fit. It's not a one-time event. You constantly have to evolve yourself and keep moving forward. And I think Microsoft have won in terms of their capitalization of where they sit in terms of the most valuable companies. But I think in many ways they've stayed their fingers on the pulse with AI and investing in AI. But for the most part, why is it that companies fail to keep winning, keep moving forward, and keep staying at the top?
I'll answer that question in two ways. I think first and foremost, companies like Microsoft and Oracle and Google have very unique leadership. And while many of them, I think, continue to sort of do incredibly well and grow revenues, if you look at why they are successful in the long term, I would suggest they're fast followers, actually. I don't think that Microsoft invented AI. I don't think Microsoft invented the operating system. I don't think Microsoft invented the database. I don't think Microsoft invented personal productivity tools. But when it didn't invent the browser, but when it saw the opportunity, it executed so incredibly well. And it must, somewhere in that organization, determine what the disruptions are and how quickly they can capitalize on those winners. And that's a credit to itself. What we tend to do here in the Valley is a little bit more invention. And I think invention has a chance of success, but probably a higher chance of failure. We sometimes, I think, invent, and if we have that chance to be successful, we all sort of, I think, suffer from sort of feeling good about our invention almost to a fault. And probably the most important, I think, thing that I've learned in this Valley is perspective. And my favorite saying here is, be careful when you can't see the forest for the trees. And oftentimes you get so close to something and that you become sort of almost brainwashed by it, believing it, that it is the best thing ever and it will have longevity. And when you step back, you're like, oh, it doesn't matter anymore. It's completely irrelevant. I mean, I lived through on-premise software to SaaS software. And I can tell you, I sat in front of so many customers that told me under no circumstances would they use a cloud. All of them are using clouds. So there is that sort of deniability. And I think if you think about the normal distribution from early adopters to the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards, if you go looking for evidence to prove or disprove your hypothesis, you will, by definition, speak to too many people who are in the early and late majority, and who will tell you they just want tomorrow to feel like today. They don't want change. People don't like change, and they resist it. I can imagine like Henry Ford going out and saying, I've got this great idea. It's called the automobile. Well, I've got my horse, and I like my horse, and I don't want this thing because my horse is my friend. The reason so many companies, even in this Valley, fail, I think the S&P now turns over about every 10 years, to give you a sense of the rate of change here. And if you think about just this recent transformation from sort of application software to AI, look, amongst friends, Salesforce never helped a salesperson sell anything. And it never really gave you the answer. It was really a process, a machine that created sort of visibility and accountability. But it took salespeople away from selling to document all of the things. And so if AI can now take care of that back-end work for you and be your sort of partner, whether it's a co-pilot or it's an augmentation, it turns SaaS on its head and you're like, oh my God, I don't need all of this stuff anymore. I can redo this in a very different way. And I think that's what's brilliant. When you look at the interfaces of OpenAI, GPT, and Claude from Anthropic, they're beautiful. They're just a little box with a lot of white space around them. And when you bring up an enterprise application, it's like tabs and subtabs and workflows and validation rules. And oh my God, it's like horrible. And those applications are passive. When I log out of Salesforce at night and I come back the next day and log in, it looks just like I left it. Why has this thing not been working overnight? Why has this thing not been helping me? And I think that's a big change, and one I think that AI, I think, has fundamentally shifted the concept of sort of tools to outcomes. And it makes so much sense. It's just that nobody was doing it, and we were all thinking a very different way. So I think the problem that most companies have in general is perspective, and being willing and able to challenge your own assumption, your own hypothesis as to sort of whether it is true or false. And I think you have to do that continuously. I was fortunate enough to work for Larry Ellison for 6 years at Oracle. The man is a genius. He's always hypothesizing what's next. He had Oracle and invested in Salesforce and NetSuite because he believed that those were disruptive delivery mechanisms. They weren't really disruptive technologies, but he invested in them, and I think saw the opportunity to to transform Oracle. And Oracle is relevant today because Larry demands continuous transformation, and Microsoft does the same thing. So many companies just don't. They get excited about what they're doing. Yahoo versus Google, right? Yahoo thought the internet could be controlled, and they monetized page views. Google came along and monetized click-throughs. And all of a sudden, Yahoo's pages were irrelevant because Google could connect you to more contextually rich, more applicable pages that they didn't control. So simple things like that, I think, can turn a market upside down very quickly.
It's interesting, right? Like, I think, you mentioned Larry, and I was just thinking about a few of the guests I've had on the show. Like, I had Bob Moglio on the show, who worked very closely with Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer. And I just come to think about the companies that win and the companies that keep winning, they have a certain pedigree of founders or leaders at the top and a team, a really strong team. One thing that Bob said to me about Bill Gates is that he had a strong belief today was Microsoft's death. Like, today will be the day that we die, and that paranoia of constantly innovating is what kept the business growing. And it seems like that ethos has continued with all the different leaders they've had in the business, which is phenomenal to see. But if you look back at your career and the leaders that you've worked with and the leader that you are today, what does it take to constantly win? Like, before you answer the question, I just think about the Blockbuster story and Netflix. And I always think about Blockbuster should have been Netflix. I think with the right leadership team, they could have won the game of what Netflix ended up building. This idea of paranoia and that innovation, that constant need to just think about what's next. When you look at the people that you've worked with or for and the way you run things, what does it take? What sort of characteristics and skills, to really get into the inside the Silicon mind, get into the mind of individuals now? What does it take to win?
Well, I think you're too kind. I would say, certainly speaking for myself, I've had failures. And I would tell you, Larry Ellison has had failures. Bill Gates has had failures. And I think what makes them good is they have environments and support systems and considerations that allow people to fail. I can't remember who told me once, but they sort of said you can fail your way to the top in Silicon Valley. And I think it's true. I think it's true. I think there is a culture here where, we say nothing ventured, nothing gained, right? And it is about ventures here. And Larry Ellison has tried many things that haven't worked. Bill Gates was building MSN and then shut MSN down to take the internet. That was probably a very difficult decision for him. Just recently, Mark Zuckerberg invested billions in his virtual world and shut that down to take on AI. So I think what takes a good leader here is sort of a process by which you are bound by a hypothesis, but only to the point of proving or disproving it.
Right.
And I think that's the hard part. The hard part for some people, and I'm guilty of it, is you fall in love with what you're doing.
Yeah.
And you just will it. You really will it to be right. And then you sort of, you get feedback and you sort of, you don't listen intently to it, and you're not prepared to adjust or to cancel. So I think the good leaders have a sort of a clinical mind where they will write down what they think the world wants, but then very, very quickly adjust or cancel something. And I think that's the hardest part, I think, in this valley is recognizing when your hypothesis is wrong. And that's difficult. And what's challenging is you can be right, wrong. And that's really hard. That's really hard for organizations to accept. And I think the good leaders are the ones that sort of are constantly assessing the past fail of the work that they're doing and then making adjustments. Some could be small, some can be very, very significant. Oracle bought Sun for a set of hypotheses, most of which have been proven wrong. And Larry was very clear that when they were proven to be wrong, he would shut them down. And I think that's the testament of a good leader here is you're constantly imagining and hypothesizing what the world will be, testing, but to a point of pass or fail. And I think that's the hard part. The hard part is failing and recognizing failure at a time and separating your emotion and your desires from what the market wants.
I want to use the case study of Blockbuster as one that I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on, because I remember growing up, we would go to the Blockbuster video store and rent a video, and it was the best Friday. You get some popcorn, go and you watch the movie with your family, and it was such a warm feeling. And it's sad. I wish we could go back to that day. It was really fun to do that. But now you have all these different streaming platforms, Netflix, Amazon Prime, Paramount, etc. But if we just think about that Blockbuster story, right? They had so much revenue. They had all these stores all over the world. And then this tiny little startup, Netflix, comes along. And I think there was at some point where they were thinking about being acquired by Blockbuster, which didn't turn out. But the reason I want to touch on it as a case study is because I feel like that's a really good example of not willing to just take a risk, take a real big risk. You mentioned with Oracle and Larry and taking on Sun. And even if you think about Netflix's story, they were also willing to do the same thing years later, because a lot of their revenue was coming from the mail order business. You decide to scrap all of that and go after the streaming business. What's your thoughts there on that particular case study and how that kind of sits with, I guess, what we're discussing here around innovation?
There are so many good examples. I have a sort of a theory, and it's sort of most commonly called discontinuity theory. And what discontinuity theory suggests is that markets are never made, they are just resegmented. And they are resegmented by one or more of four possible reasons. One is there's a regulatory change. The second is there's an alternative path of distribution. The third is the emergence of standards. And the fourth is there's a technology shift. So when I think about Blockbuster and Netflix, just those two, and the massive shift in revenue and customer, it was very simple. I think what Netflix figured out was CD was a technology that was better than video tape. And because CDs were sort of engineered in a certain way, they could send them through the mail to people with a high degree of certainty that the product wouldn't be damaged, and that the CD itself could be sent around to multiple people at a much lower total cost of ownership than a video cassette. So I think there was a technology shift that Netflix had and didn't really have the same legacy video library that Blockbuster had. I think the more important one was probably the alternative path of distribution, the mail versus store. And stores are just very expensive. The inventories are very difficult to maintain. And Netflix had an opportunity with a new technology and a new path of delivery to come in at a price point that was sort of much more successful for its business and its gross margin, and ultimately the experience it delivered to the consumer. Now, to your point, what Reed, I think Hastings did incredibly well was he disrupted himself and said, I don't think that CDs is the right path of distribution. I think online will be the right path. And he started when bandwidth was pretty crap. And what he said was, I'm just going to write an algorithm that basically constantly looks at the network and what's available to me and will change the streaming rates. Now, we all had some pretty blurry experiences, but it kind of worked. But credit to that company, they sacrificed themselves. They burned the boats they came in on. And I think that's a testament to that sort of paranoia, that desire to sort of to stand back sometimes and look at the way you've been doing something and to challenge it. But more often not, my favorite story of discontinuity is probably Michael Dell. Michael started Dell Computers 15 years after IBM shipped the personal computer. And it was the same processor. He bought the same disks. He had the same chassis, there was nothing different. Not one thing was different about the technology that Michael had, or IBM, or HP, or Compaq had. The only thing he did differently, he sold direct. It took HP 15 years to sell a PC direct after Michael started. Why? Because their legacy was the reseller channel. And the reseller channel denied HP from going direct. And Dell became the leader, not through technology, but just through a very simple alternative path of distribution that the incumbents denied. And I think cloud versus on-premise, there's no different technology. Salesforce is still a bunch of code sitting on a bunch of databases running on a bunch of servers, much like Siebel was. But it said, I think I can disrupt the distribution path, and instead of empowering the IT organization, I can empower the sales organization. And I think that's the beautiful thing, is my favorite of everything, and the thing that I have tried to do more than anything else, is democratize stuff. When something is difficult, can you make it easier? And if you can, that gives you typically a market size that's 1 or potentially 2 orders of magnitude bigger. And I love that. I love it when, if you think about a mainframe, when people first saw like a Windows PC, it's not a mainframe. And I write machine code over here, and what do you mean I have to write an abstract language? It's going to be slow. And the answer was, well, yes, but how many people will have a PC versus how many people will have a mainframe? But the mainframe people, no, terrible idea. And I just love the fact that the incumbents deny it. But more often than not, you will find there isn't much technology that drives disruption or innovation. Like Google versus Yahoo, that wasn't a technology shift. It was a distribution. It was the way in which people consumed the information that shifted. And I love those kinds of analogies. So I think Netflix did incredibly well against Blockbuster by disrupting the physical store. And then, all credit to itself, it decided to disrupt itself. And I think that's the hard part. When you can sit back and make a call like that, and tell the whole company, hey, we're successful, but we're going to fail unless we change. Can you imagine what the employees must have thought? I know we're good, but we're going to stop doing all this. And that takes a lot of nerve and a lot of, I think, confidence in being wrong, actually. So I think those are sort of lessons I've learned, is look for the disruption, create a hypothesis around it, and figure out who loses when you win. One of the best questions I ever got from VCs, folks at Redpoint asked me, whose ox gets gored? And I do believe that. I believe for every winner there is a loser. I don't believe that there's free money sitting around waiting for something. People have spent what they can spend, and so if you have something new, as much as you telling the person why new is good, you have to tell them what to replace and what to stop doing.
There's so much to unpack there. So I think there's a few things I definitely want to talk to you about based on what you just said. First of all, it seems like the whole Netflix story, when we think about the market shift or new technology shifts, perhaps there's 2 pieces there from what you've just said. Is the CD and there's the internet for Netflix. Those 2 pieces came in at that right time to disrupt the way things were done. You talked about distribution, and then Reed Hastings disrupting himself. There's another part of that from a engineering standpoint with the chaos monkey theory that was born out of Netflix, and how they effectively found ways to break themselves to improve themselves. And I like what you said earlier on. Markets are never made; they are resegmented. You also mentioned something else, which was the reseller channel. I feel like one problem that I see, not just in technology, but this need to just create industries. One particular industry that I feel like is, when you think about mortgage brokers, as an example, I feel like with AI, there's an opportunity there. And not to say that these people don't deserve to, I mean, there are some great mortgage brokers, but I've just been through it a couple of times recently, so that's why it's a bit of a frustration for me. I just feel like it's so easy just to tick boxes and see if a computer just says yes or no. But there's also a story behind whether something makes sense or not. And I feel like when you think about reseller channels, for example, we use Mimecast internally at Harrison Clark, but we go through a reseller. And it's frustrating for me because I just feel like I want to speak to Mimecast directly. Why am I going through a reseller? Thankfully, other providers like Okta, etc., we go direct. But I feel like this whole reseller channel, it's an entire business, entire industry that I feel like it's to me, it's pointless. But for you who've run businesses and run business today, what is the value of even having a reseller channel?
Well, so I think there are values, but I think the word I would amend to reseller is value added reseller. If they add value, then they deserve to exist because they're doing something that the primary vendor doesn't do. And it might be just as simple as credit risk. Maybe the larger organization doesn't have the capabilities or the desire to take on the credit risk that's associated with smaller companies. Maybe it's an inventory. Resellers who hold inventory of hardware have a value add that the hardware OEM itself doesn't have, which is if you need something tomorrow, the reseller has value in that they hold a particular inventory, which costs them money. I think it's the same thing in software. If there is added value, customers will recognize that added value. But if there isn't, then I would argue what purpose does a reseller serve? And I do feel a lot of resale happened because of reach. Companies couldn't afford to have salespeople in every country in the world.
Sure.
Companies couldn't afford support people. Probably a lot of resale happened just based on geographic limitation and opportunity. That's all changed. The internet now gives you ubiquity to reach customers very, very quickly in all parts of the world at a much lower cost and a much higher margin. So I do think that resale has been itself through a reimagination, a resegmentation. Look, I think AI, is forcing the industry to blur the software and service line for the first time. And it just makes so much sense that, look, again, when you buy Salesforce and you say, I'm entering into a contract with Salesforce, they send you an admin URL and a username and password. And then you're like, what am I doing with that? Well, you have to go find an implementation partner. And the implementation partner will do the implementation, but then you're like, okay, well, when Salesforce releases some new stuff, how do I retire this stuff? And Salesforce, well, that's not our stuff. Talk to the service provider. And the service provider says, well, I did the implementation, but if you want me to change it, you're going to have to pay more. And I think that those two layers were necessary under the business model that we've been operating with. But AI blurs that. AI is like, no. And I think if you look at the service industries, AI is cutting through those like a hot knife through butter. I mean, it's just saying no. I think companies like Palantir challenged that model of software and service. And Palantir is an amazing company. And I was lucky enough to be there for a while. And they only talk about outcome. And they engineer those outcomes. They will not customize. They will engineer. And that gives the customer a sense of confidence that's generated significant investments in Palantir. They win contracts in tens and hundreds of millions of dollars because they demonstrate outcomes and they contract for those outcomes. I don't think the SaaS industry ever really contracted for outcomes. And while the service organization contracted for outcomes, they weren't given the ability to engineer them. And I think that's what you're going to see now. Is you're going to see a world that the service layer and the software layer combine. And the term I think that we all use is sort of software as labor. And that's a really exciting proposition because the labor budgets are much higher than the infrastructure budgets. I'm lucky, I think, to be in this industry. And there's a famous article Mark Andreessen wrote for the Wall Street Journal about software eating the world. And I still believe that to be true. And you count software out at your own peril. It's been proven. I mean, what Mark's article suggested, rightly so, that the biggest media company in the world was the software company, Google. The biggest HR company in the world was a software company, LinkedIn. And so it went on. And I think that just continues to be the way it is. And I think arguably the biggest services company in the world is OpenAI. It's delivering a service. And that service has intellectual property that challenges, I think, the cost and the time constraints of human beings. Agents don't sleep. Agents can be switched on and switched off in seconds. Think about Accenture with like 400,000 people. They work hard, but they're expensive.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be the next big trend. Is I think services companies will have to become software companies, and software companies will come up and take more and more of the service revenue.
I love what you said there, because I think that I heard this before as well, that the service industry is probably the last one to get disrupted, or at least one of the last few to get disrupted. And we're seeing that now with this new technology. And even you mentioned like the big four, the management consultancies. I think they're, honestly, I mean, to charge the amount they charge for someone to come into your business to just read your own data and then provide you with a report. Honestly, I think it's crazy that exists. Anthony, it's been honestly an absolute pleasure having you on the show. We've touched on some very key points, and I wanted this one to be very different, considering both our backgrounds coming from the UK. I'd love to see UK really innovate and open major opportunities, because I think we have some of the best universities in the world, some of the smartest people in the world. I think we're centralized very nicely in terms of where we sit on the map. But it'd be really good if we could learn as a country, whether politically or not, from how Silicon Valley does things, because I really do believe this is one of the greatest places in the world. I said this on a previous podcast, to what you said earlier on, if you're in tech, you need to be here. This is where it's at. And every time I fly out of California and SF and I come back, there's this serendipity that exists that's insane, and I love it. So I think you and I are both we're two of many people who've come to this place and been part of this amazing ecosystem, which we both love. One last question I want to ask you, Anthony. So we have a tradition on this show to end it always with a book recommendation. And I'd love to get one from you, one that truly resonates with you, a book that has truly inspired you, maybe in keeping, potentially, I don't know, maybe not, but if it is in keeping with what we've discussed today, that'd be even better. Do you have one that you could recommend to our guests, or our audience?
Yeah, I have quite a few. I'll give a plug for my founder and president, Bob Goodson. Bob just published a book called The Button That Changed the World. I've read it, and I think it's a really good book. There are all the classics, Geoffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm, Enter the Tornado. All of those are great books. Innovator's Dilemma, The Tipping Point. But no, my plug would go to my colleague and founder, Bob Goodson. Like The Button That Changed the World. It's a really, really good button. If you think about it, that little thumbs up thing that happened has, in many ways, dictated the successes and failures of so many companies and so many products. That companies, I think, are sort of, again, fundamentally challenged in that they think that what they say is right. And I have always, I think, stressed the importance of the difference between opinion and fact. And opinion exists on the inside, and fact can only exist on the outside. Customers are really the only thing that matters. They will dictate to you your success or your failure. And so many companies, I think, now benefit from that simple button, that simple request for, is this good or is this bad, that has affected an industry unlike anything else. And so my book recommendation, again, The Button That Changed the World. It's available on Amazon and every other good bookstore, but it was a really good read, and huge credit to Bob Goodson, the effort it took him to write a book like that, along with Martin Reeves. But I would say it's a really good read, and it really does, I think, force you to sort of think outside in, not inside out, which a lot of companies struggle to do well.
I love it. That's a definitely one that I'm going to be getting because it's new, and I definitely can resonate with that. I think if I think about this podcast, for example, we are looking for subscribers and likes. We want people to like the shows and the episodes that we put out. And you're absolutely right about the customers. It is all about the customers. I mean, as you said, Amazon, the book's on Amazon. I mean, Jeff Bezos is a really good example of somebody who truly believes in that philosophy of focusing, being maniacally focused on the customers. Anthony, it's been an absolute pleasure. I know we were supposed to do this in person, but we ended up doing it over remotely, but I'm sure we'll do it again in person. It really has been a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for so many lessons. Hopefully a lot of people enjoy it.
Yeah, my pleasure, Faraz. It's great to have more Brits. I'd like to see more Brits out here. I like you. I think the university system is very special in the UK. I think there's a lot of talent there, and I have tried many times to promote the Valley to people in the UK and urge them to come out here. There's a lot of opportunity here, and it can be a lot of fun. But thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Inside the Silicon Mind. This podcast is powered by Harrison Clark. For more episodes, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. As always, stay curious, stay consistent, and stay inside the Silicon Mind.